Russia seems condemned to repeat the mistakes of history rather than learning from them, as shown by Putin's mass mobilization of Russian males into the armed forces and the shock and panic it prompted earlier this year in Russia. Konstantin Samoilov is a well-known YouTuber whose channel Inside Russia comments insightfully on Russia's descent into authoritarianism over the last few years. But now, like many others, he's outside Russia with no idea of when or if he can return there. Please subscribe to this channel and like the video if you found this content interesting. It would be really great if other people can discover the amazing guests that we feature on Silicon Curtain. Konstantin, I've watched a lot of your videos over a long time, and I've seen your journey through this crisis, and wanted to know a lot more about you. So welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Well, let's start with, what, it's a fairly obvious question, but what was the trigger point for you to leave Russia? And you held out for quite a long time, didn't you?
I held out until the very last minute I could. Many times on many occasions I said, and that's how I felt, that it would be a personal tragedy if I had to leave Russia. And my intent was to stay until the last minute, and I did. The trigger point for me was the mobilization was announced, and I feared that I would be mobilized. And basically, I do daily live streams. And at the end of every live stream, I would say goodbye to all viewers, because I really felt like I could go any minute and it would be my last stream, okay? So I did that for a few days, and I literally left before they knocked on my door. The whole idea of being grabbed and thrown into Ukraine, given an AK-47 and ordered to kill Ukrainians, is just would horrify me. So I waited until the last minute, and when I felt this horrible reality could happen, I left. I fled, escaped.
As many people, back when I was living in Russia, almost everybody under a certain age would have done compulsory military service. But did your generation have to serve in the army? Did you have prior experience?
I did not have any prior experience. I'm nearsighted. Therefore, I was not the subject of draft when I was 18. And I also, like you, did asthma. I had asthma when I was a child, so that would disqualify me as well. When I was growing up, it wasn't a big deal. Of course, Chechnyan war was happening, and right at the time when I needed, well, when it was my time to go to draft, a couple of my classmates went to Chechnya, but that was the last big event for Russian draft. After that, draft was not taken seriously. Basically, you could dodge it by not showing up to the mobilization center until you were 27, you turned 27, and then after 27, they wouldn't touch you. You were off the hook. Of course, everything changed in 2022.
And one of the videos I did with Vlad Vexler, who's a sociologist in London, was called capricious conscription, because the things you've mentioned that would normally preclude you from being called up, like asthma, short-sightedness, and a whole range of medical conditions, normally there would be, bureaucratic procedures would be observed, and you'd have the form and an exemption. But that's changed, isn't it? And we've moved to a state of lawlessness in an extent. So these kind of administrative bits of paper wouldn't necessarily work. You'd be dragged off to the Vankomat or the conscription office, and really none of that would matter anymore. Is that a true impression?
You said one word correctly. Normally, I would be exempt. Normally, thousands of other Russians would be exempt. due to their medical conditions, due to their age, due to their political beliefs, not political, but the Christian beliefs and so forth. There are many exemptions in Russia for a person not to go and serve in the army. But normally, what's happening right now is not normal. It's very dire circumstances, and of course, things have changed. And in on September 21st, 2022, everything changed.
It's become a very unpredictable situation, hasn't it? And while you were still recording in Russia, I remember watching quite a few of your videos before and after you left, and there was a definite restraint in what you were saying, and I could tell you were thinking very carefully about every phrase, the nuance, and how it might be interpreted. Since you've left, I think your sort of style of video making and your narrative is a lot sort of I won't say relaxed. That's definitely the wrong word, but you know what I mean. You don't seem to have those same constraints on you.
Absolutely, you are absolutely right. I used to watch every single word I would say because of one simple reason. There are new laws that they were introduced in February 2022, days after the start of this tragedy that Russia started invading Ukraine. And the laws basically forbade Russians to say the truth about this whole thing. If you named what was happening in Ukraine, the war, you would be fined, and then you would be going to the prison. If you said something about Russian army that would contradict the official agency, a Russian Ministry of Defense point of view, Russian government, then you would fall under category of defaming Russian troops, and that would be a sentence behind the bars. So, I have a family, large family, I have many kids. Lots of people rely on me, and I was watching every word I said. But since I moved out of Russia into Uzbekistan, you're absolutely right. I'm not more relaxed, that's the wrong word, but I'm more bold.
Absolutely, and I think that's what's impressive as well. It's even the things you were saying in Russia. It's difficult to know how they're going to be taken. It's difficult to know if and when people are going to act against that. And I know from hearing the stories of, say, Ilya Yashin, also Viktor Shenderovich is another personality, a commentator I follow. They had warnings. They had friends, relatives, even officials who were sympathetic to them via a back channel saying, you know what, it's time to get out because I've heard a rumor that, something's going to happen or a case is going to be started against you. Did you have any of those sort of threats, direct or indirect, before you left?
I had a gut feeling. No one called me on the phone, no one warned me, but I had a very strong gut feeling.
And many other people.
A lot of YouTubers, my fellow YouTubers, would call me and say, "Hey, you know what you're doing is really dangerous. Aren't you afraid for your family? Aren't you afraid for that you might be locked up, charged, and so forth?" Lots of people who watched in Russia, who watched my channel and my daily streams, they said the same thing, and I had a very strong gut feeling.
It's like the writing was on the wall to an extent, wasn't it? And I think watching in horror through, obviously at a distance, I live in Oxford, it's safe, it's comfortable. It's, when I say these things, I'm fully aware that it's from a position of not being threatened. But through 2021, things started to, I think, intensify, didn't they? The foreign agent laws were brought in. Some people started to be sort of threatened. In Belarus, things were intensifying. And we know that Belarus is very tightly controlled, not just locally, but obviously through the Kremlin as well. And did you get the sense as well through 2021 that things were starting to degenerate?
Yes, I did. Any normal, sane person would start noticing it in 2021, and what happened after in 2022 was just horrific. But answering your question, yes, I did. I started feeling it on my skin.
And do people around you discuss it, or is it one of these sort of unspoken things that everyone knows it's happening, but it's not necessarily something you want to fully air?
In Russia, we have always talked politics. We have always discussed in inner circles. And in my inner circle, things were discussed, definitely. And I was not the only one feeling that. Other people around me also were feeling it. But people from, other circles who are not that close to me, they prefer not to share their opinions, because at that point already there was fear of prosecution.
That's right. And, there are a few prominent people like Navalny, Yashin, Karamurza, who've made
Exactly.
very visible statements, but of course, they're also being monitored by various Russian and international organizations. If you're an activist or even a YouTuber that is well known within your circle, but not well known in the international media, I mean, you could disappear and you wouldn't necessarily have people fighting your corner.
Jonathan, nowadays, even if you are well known in the Western circles, circuits, then anything can happen to you. They don't care. They used to think about what they would think in the West about that, what kind of image Russia would have, and so forth. But those times have long gone, have long been gone.
Yeah. And they've painted themselves into a bit of a corner. I mean, it's a fairly desperate situation, isn't it? Now, I'm really interested to know whether
I'm sorry, the masks are off.
the
The
masks are
masks
off.
are
Yes,
off. That's it.
definitely. I mean, not everybody. I mean, there are regions of the world that still buy into some of the propaganda messages. There are other countries that understand what's going on, but perhaps don't care for expedient reasons, economic reasons. Um, if I name the countries here, we'll get a lot of angry comments. But we know that the global south, India, China, others, while not actively supporting the war, nonetheless have not been actively involved in the sanctions regime. And to an extent, it's sort of business as normal. But I'm really interested to find out, were you involved in political activism before you started the channel? Or is the channel is that, part of your awakening, as it were, into becoming political?
I was involved, but very little. And it was a mistake. I should have been involved much more. I realize that now. And this, I don't even know how to say this, tragedy of cosmic scale that started happening on the 24th of February, 2022 was my awakening moment. I definitely woke up.
I mean, for some, Crimea in 2014, and I think probably tends to be people perhaps who are a little older. But 2012, Bolotnaya, 2014, there was quite a small wave, but there was a small wave of people who left at that point, wasn't there? And that to an extent was when I think the mask started to slip, but not fall from Putin's regime. Do you have memories of 2014 or your sort of feelings around that, or what people were saying when Crimea was taken?
Very clear. I have memories of that moment, like it was yesterday. The Olympics in Sochi was finishing up, and Maidan was happening in Ukraine, and Crimea was annexed by Russia.
And for a while, the way that was done was a very sort of hybrid method, wasn't it? It wasn't admitted at the time, but to me, it was clear what was going on. Did most of the people understand exactly what was going on? Did they see through the sort of hybrid espionage mode of the invasion?
No. Are you talking about 2014 and Crimea?
Crimea, And then, of course, in Donbass, you had the little green men, you had the sort of, again, a sort of hybrid invasion as well. To an extent, that's still debated, of course, but I think it's fairly clear now, certainly on Crimea. It's relatively clear. There's quite a lot of research coming out now about the mechanisms by which arms, troops, etc., directly came over from Russia, and how the insurgency was essentially sort of organized and supported by the GRU. I think that's becoming fairly well documented.
If we're talking about Crimea, the picture was much clearer than Donbass, and you're absolutely right. Donbass was much less clear. Okay, and now we have information coming out, but not back then. A lot of Russians were definitely misinformed of what was happening in Donbass, and it was really hard to get the information. Okay, it was very ambiguous, coming from different sources. At that point already, the government was doing everything to make information coming from the West looking not too reliable, and they succeeded to some point. So a lot of people just didn't really know the truth. But
Well, they
you're
were very
absolutely right. The
successful.
truth
Yeah.
is coming out. It's coming out now.
No, they were very successful because the West didn't really impose sanctions at that point. Even when the airliner was downed, there were no really strong sanctions. And if we think back even further to Skripal, again, it seemed absolutely obvious to me, because I'm extremely cynical. I was in Russia in the 90s, and if you've been in St. Petersburg in the 90s, which was a bit of a bandit town back then, you'd come to believe that, one, there are no accidents, there are no coincidences, there are no accidents. There's always someone benefits behind every disaster, and that's the kind of cynical mindset that I sort of started to develop back then. But I had friends of mine in St. Petersburg calling me when the Skripal poisoning happened, and they were saying, like, "Why are you saying these things? We couldn't have done that. It's such a horrific thing. We hate Putin, but we couldn't have done that. That's not what we're like. It's just too much." What are your feelings on that? Because it's very difficult, isn't it, to accept that your country does bad things. Same with the British in Ireland. Even now, I think a lot of British people have difficulties in accepting the crimes committed by the British Empire in Ireland in the 20th century, and obviously in India.
Jonathan, if you're talking about Skripal, then you got to take one step back and talk about Litvinenko. Okay, same thing happened way before. You are spot on. That is a very difficult thing to admit, that what some powers in your country do is wrong and is everything against your values. To me, situation with Ukraine on the 24th of February was even worse, because I was the first person, and I was publicly speaking on YouTube, arguing that Russia would never invade Ukraine. Russia would never attack Ukraine because it's impossible. I was saying that publicly, and I feel like a fool. But I admit that, because it was everything against what I believed in, everything against I understood about Ukraine. And I know Ukraine quite well. I lived there for a year. I worked for a Ukrainian company for a long time. I have many Ukrainian friends. Up to this day, I have Ukrainian friends. So I know this country quite a bit. And obviously I know Russia quite well. And couldn't even think of Russia doing this. It was incredible. And when I realized, everything broke down inside of me. You go into an array of very negative emotions, very dark emotions, lots of pain, lots of heartache, even tears. You sit there and you're totally dismayed. Your world, gets destroyed right in front of you. Your values that you were raised upon turned out to be fake. And this is a personal tragedy. It's definitely been a personal tragedy to me. And you know what? It's been intensifying. It's even worse now, 10 months after this, I don't know, tragedy of cosmic scale.
And of course, it's becoming clearer that Ukraine has a chance of actually winning. I know, and at the end of the interview, we'll talk about sort of what the future might hold. But Ukraine looks like it has a good chance of not just surviving, but actually eventually winning. Even if it ends in stalemate, they're going to end in a better position than they were, say, in February. But for Russia, it's difficult. I mean, we'll talk about the politics in a minute, but all the positive things that do undoubtedly exist in Russian culture, that tradition of music, literature, great architecture. There are many things which attracted me to looking, to learning the language, and it's an incredibly beautiful language. But at this point, another tragic element is that all those things, people aren't receptive to those things at the moment. It'll take a very long time for Russia's soft cultural power to return.
I totally agree with that. I think it's going to take more than a generation. Everything that's been done great in Russia, and there were some things that were actually great, has been canceled by the current actions of Russian government and some Russian people. And again, this is a tragedy for the country, and this is my personal tragedy also.
I mean, it's very positive that you have got Ukrainian relationships, and I'm sure you've reached out to them, which is actually a very rare thing. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of Ukrainians now who have not just friends and colleagues, but relatives. And some have actively argued with those relatives, some have not heard from them at all. And another tragedy is that some people are not, I would say, as thoughtful as you. They don't explore, their emotions and the history, and actually have been quite susceptible to the propaganda built on weaponized history, weaponized mythology. When you heard those things or saw those things while you were in Russia, did you fight them, or is it difficult to sort of keep silent when you hear people repeating these kind of things?
Are you talking about regular people,
Just regular
one-on-one
people, yeah,
communications?
relatives, regular people.
Jonathan, it's a very difficult, complicated question.
Mm.
Of course, I argued with every single person who would say something that I felt and I, believed was not true. Because it's really hard to fool me. I've been to Ukraine. I know lots of Ukrainians, regular Ukrainian people. I spent over a year. I traveled on business trips to Kiev, Kharkov, Odessa, Dnieper, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye. I've been all over the place. And when Russians would say something that was not true, I would just contradict them and I would try to explain. With some people at work, but unfortunately, majority was so sad on what they heard from TV, then it was really difficult to talk to them. I faced two choices. First choice was to start avoiding communications. The second choice was continue to do what I had been doing before, trying to convince people, trying to tell them the truth. And I'm talking one-on-one, personal, interpersonal communications, And I decided to keep on going because even if I explained to one person and I succeeded in one person, that would be great, So I kept on speaking to all people I could reach to until the very last moment I was in Russia.
That's absolutely that's a difficult thing to do, but impressive.
Very, very much easier to just take your head and put it into the sand like an ostrich. That's
Yeah.
it.
And it's not just Russia. I mean, we have to be honest. In 2016, we had the Brexit issue in Britain. It's not on the same scale, but you had generations arguing with each other. You had families arguing with each other, brothers, sisters. I argued with, at every family party I went to, I'd argue and I'd be a complete bore, and everyone would hate it. And the first few months, everyone was up for the debate, but as you say, after month of the same kind of news cycle, the same kind of arguments, a lot of people tune out. Do you think that's what's sort of happening a lot now? I see that the ratings of Solovyov and Simonyan, which were relatively high at the start of the war, their TV ratings have actually been going down month on month. So are people kind of tuning out of that toxicity and hatred?
It's really difficult to conceal the truth for a long, long time. It's fairly easy to do so for a short time, but you cannot go on like that, and it's been 10 months. My gosh, how long do you need to wake up to finally start getting like asking questions, putting twos and twos together, and I think that's what's happening in Russia. More and more people waking up, because there are some things happening that's really difficult to not to look at. The economy is basically falling apart. The military operation is not going as planned. Russia annexed land and then gave it up 5 weeks later, deliberately left. All kinds of things happening that kind of, that they're just really hard to overlook. And I think people start asking more and more questions. And that's why the ratings are going down. That's why the social unrest is rising in Russia. And that's why the general support of the government is, declining.
And Ukraine has been quite clever, haven't they, in some ways? Their Western partners behind the scenes have been telling them not to, I think, anger the Russians, not to escalate in that sort of that phrase. But they've been sending drones in. They've clearly got either collaborators or agents on the ground, because air bases are being blown up 600 kilometers. I mean, I looked on the map and it's not that far from Moscow, the one that happened
Not too
yesterday.
far. Not too
Um,
far.
that is the kind of thing that I think would people would actually spread that news, whether it's through anecdotes or to secret sort of messages exchanged. They may not be political, but that's the kind of shocking news that they would share.
Jonathan, that's not anecdote. That's a very serious thing. And again, the masks are off. People are not afraid of talking about that. They are angrily asking questions publicly. They're saying, what the heck is going on? Where is our so glorious, as we've been told many, many times, anti-air missile defense system that has been has locked Russian airspace so no one can fly there? What about this happening? This is black and white. There's no gray there, and these questions are asked openly. People don't hush hush anymore.
Mm. And that's got to break out at some point, one would hope, in some form of dissent,
It
even if
will.
it's a palace coup, even if it's someone taking advantage of that fragile or weakened situation. We mentioned the economy, and I want to turn to that because many of your videos are very compelling. They're also, entertaining, especially the ones you were filming before you left. And you went to the revamped McDonald's, you went to the empty shopping centers and filmed. And I found some of those videos extremely moving because they counteracted the propaganda message that everything's okay and we can substitute all these brands and everything's going to be fine. You've worked in business. I think you understand more of the economic impact. So I'd love to hear, your experience and views on that.
I have had my own businesses quite a few of them. And I worked for a large corporation for almost 20 years. So you're right, I've been in business for most of my life. And it's really hard to fool me. I always say this: my camera does not lie. Anyone can tell you anything, thousands of words. But when you take a camera and show people the picture, that's worth more than thousands of words. Okay, so I don't need to comment. I don't need to say anything. I just take my camera and I film. And that's what I did in Russia while I was there. It's just angers me so much when I hear one thing and everything is peachy dory, and you go out on the street and then you see completely different thing. That's propaganda as its best. So I tried to stand up as much as I could. I would just take my camera, I would film, and I would show the world saying, hey, look, I don't have to tell you anything. This is what is around me. Okay, just look, ask questions, make your own decisions, make your own analysis. Well, basically that's what I've been doing. That's the idea of the channel.
And a lot of people, I imagine, have had to change their lifestyles, cut down, stop spending on certain things, whether it's goods or services, go for, if they're available, substitute brands and so on. What do you think is the real impact on people's lives? And I say people in the general sense because I know there's going to be a big difference between the large urban centers, the provinces, the villages, or if you get out into the sort of, the Far Eastern territories. It's a vast country with a huge range of different lifestyles and peoples. But what's the impression you get? I mean, I realize people in the small villages, probably it's not going to impact them that much. They're living more as subsistence lifestyle anyway. But in large cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, how are the more middle-class professional people being affected?
Jonathan, this is a hugely complicated topic, the economy. Let me summarize. The last 10 months, you see, any economy is always at balance. And if something happens, for example, a bad economic event, okay, something happens to population of the country, or something happens to investors, or something happens to global markets, just one event throws economy off balance usually. But what happened in Russia on the 24th, it was obvious that a perfect storm was happening was coming and was right next door, right around the corner. And not one, not two, but almost a dozen such catastrophic events happened simultaneously, and they keep on happening. They are being a huge exodus of Russian males and Russian young people in general. They're leaving Russia left and right. Over 2 million people have left so far, according to some data. The sanctions, Western companies, over 1,000 companies have left Russia. So many workplaces were lost, jobs were lost. Foreign capital left Russia. The war is affecting Russian economy, throwing it off balance towards military industrial complex. The freedoms have been stripped from Russian people and businesses, and I could name you a few more. Imagine any economy gets hit by a set of events like that. Any economy is going to go down. As an economist, I can tell you that it's inevitable, okay? But the thing is, economy doesn't change overnight. It's a thing full of inertia, and it usually takes quite a few months for changes to start being visible. And it's really safe to say that right now we start seeing the changes. It's when it's bad, when official Russian agencies responsible for economic data, for example, Росстат, Russian Statistics Agency, The central bank, Ministry of Economic Development, they start coming out with numbers that are not so great. And they never come out with bad numbers, They don't want to anger public, but now they have for this quarter 3 of 2022. It's really, really bad. And this is just economic data. But if you look at the real life, you will see lots of people left, hundreds of thousands left. You will see jobs lost. You will see banks are under fire, have been hit really hard. They have frozen most of infrastructure projects. That's hundreds of thousands of jobs. Lots of most foreign companies have left, and they eliminated jobs. Just to name a few things. And then to summarize, a big mess is happening in Russian economy right now. That's what we're having.
And I saw an item by one of Navalny's team, who I think is by trade an economist. They were saying as well, a lot of people have left. Obviously, a lot of people, middle class professionals, IT professionals, and so on. Obviously, a lot of those who fled come from those sort of educated professional classes, but many have taken microloans, or they've maxed out their credit cards before fleeing the country. And that was an interesting point. He said, well, that economic hit hasn't happened yet, but there's a vast amount of credit and debt being built up by the people who've left. So not only have they taken their economic power, their spending power out of the country, they've also racked up a series of debts and then probably default on their mortgages. So you've got all this sort of pent up bubbles in various parts of the economy that haven't yet popped.
With all due respect, I think that what you said about people maxing out on their credit cards and taking out loans and leaving with no intention of returning and repay the loans, it is definitely truth, but it's not major. I think what is major is people losing jobs and failing on their mortgage payments, credit card payments, not because they don't want to pay, they have evil plans of, not to repay, but they don't have any money, they don't have any income left. I can judge by my industry, that's energy facility construction, huge infrastructure projects, very expensive ones, financed by the banks, very long to execute, even longer to return investments, over 10 years. They involve tens of thousands of people. And all of a sudden, in the summer of 2022, most of infrastructure projects in my industry, they have stopped. Banks don't finance anymore. The government does not help. The government has much bigger issues to worry about, and it has different things to spend money on, urgently. So therefore, entire industry is folding up. And then companies are going under. People are thrown on the streets. And it's not just my industry that I used to work in. That's, you name it, just about any industry in Russia. And that's what the biggest hit is. And then people trying to take a micro loan or a small loan and leaving. I mean, it's bad and it probably accumulates, but it's not. That's not what I would worry about,
Absolutely. Well, I imagine why Navalny's team focus on that, because they're very, they try to take these big economic issues and they try to make it personal to, create protest and so on. So I can see why they politically would focus on that. But yeah, no, I get why it's not such a big deal economically. Whereas the hit on the aviation industry, the hit on the automotive industry, those I imagine are fairly significant.
Huge, not just significant, but huge. They're of cosmic proportion. Russia hasn't faced anything like this before, I think, ever.
Because in the Soviet Union, there was a domestic production, but not just that, there were trade relations, despite the Cold War. And I was talking to a historian of the Cold War about this. Despite the relationships between the West and Russia at the very depths of the Cold War in the post-Stalin era, there were still experts traveling, there was still investment, there was still a huge amount of physical trade going on with Russia behind the scenes in wheat, materials, and so on. And Russia had domestic industries. So the components for, say, Tupolev and all these planes, they had the capacity to create the base components as well as the machines themselves. But now when it comes to, not just planes and cars, but also armaments, it seems that components industry was not something that was invested in or that much attention given to it over the last sort of 20 or 30 years.
It's so bad that there are voices in Russia that are seriously asking, so what happened? Was it the work of some kind of a great enemy of Russia? Because only enemies' deeds would destroy everything and would put all this vital industries into complete, not oblivion, I should say. Well, it's so bad that Russia must seek very vital military equipment such as drones abroad. And you probably heard that Iran came out and said that it did supply Russia with the military drones, the model. I can tell you right off the bat, but they admitted it. So in Russia, people are thinking how bad it must be that the country who sent first Sputnik into space, first, man into space, did first spacewalk and so forth, how bad it should be that this country cannot manufacture drones. I mean, that's crazy. That's just to show you how Russia it's not even behind. This industries in Russia, they're just non-existent anymore.
It's probably not deliberate, but it shows a level of indifference, doesn't it, to the important things, which talks to the wider problem, I think, which is, not necessarily geopolitics as such, but it's an elite which are literally rapacious, that are robbing the country blind to build palaces, to buy yachts. It's ultimately quite superficial what they've done with the stolen wealth.
Well, that's really hard to argue with that. If anyone asks me, oh, what about Russia's space industry or aerospace industry or, military, ground to air missile defense systems, I simply tell them, well, you can actually see them. Go to the south of France, go and see the largest yacht, very expensive, that costs like $500 million, and you look at it, and that would be partially it. Okay. So it's very obvious what happened. But the thing is, they try to cover up by blaming the West, by blaming the external enemies, so to speak, saying it's them, it's their fault. Where, how is it their fault? I always give people example. My family is my family, my responsibility. If something goes wrong in my family, it's me responsible. If there's no money in my family, that means that I don't get up in the morning and I don't go to work and I don't get the paycheck. But that's my responsibility because I can do anything I want to. I can have any job, I can make, it's up to me to make money, to make living, to provide for my kids, my wife. But I can just sit home and blame everyone else, saying, hey, it's their fault. They're trying to destroy my family. They're just trying to destroy my life, it's crazy. It's our responsibility. The family is the responsibility of family members. The country is the responsibility of the citizens of the country. Plain and simple. I don't understand why Russians don't understand this very simple truth.
And of course, hundreds of thousands of Russians have had to flee. They've had to rethink their entire lives. I mean, how difficult
I'm
do you
one of
think?
them.
You're one of
Pardon
them.
my interrupted. I'm one of them, yes.
It seems you're probably better organized, or maybe better equipped to cope, because you had that mentality of looking after yourself and your family. But how challenging do you think it will be for many of the people who've had to leave? Some of them leaving at short notice without necessarily expecting to or planning that ahead.
Jonathan, most of us have left on days' notice, hours' notice, most of us. You know, on the 25th of September, you're sitting, doing your regular things at your life, and then on the 27th, you're at a different country, and you're devastated because your entire life has been completely changed. You know, I am the witness of all of this happening. I am actually writing a book just about this, and I'm making a documentary about this process, about the exodus of Russians into neighboring countries and into Uzbekistan. That's where I am, and I am seeing thousands of Russians just like myself around me. It's much easier for me. You're absolutely right. I've done this before. At the age of 20, I moved to the United States. I spent there 9 years. I came back. I lived 2 years in Uzbekistan 10 years ago. I had a business here, so I opened office in Tashkent and Fergana, so I know this place. I lived in Ukraine for a year. I'm well traveled, and I am organized. And I'm seeing lots of people, but it's really difficult even for me.
Yeah.
I'm going through culture shock. I feel that I'm completely countryless, homeless in the worst way possible. I have this emotional roller coaster inside of me. I'm very stable emotionally usually, but what's happening right now, it's pretty bad. Most of other people, they having it worse. I have been trying to help Russians ever since I came here. I have organized social gatherings. I call it the Breakfast Club, basically trying to get people together and provide basic support, emotional support, and support in day-to-day life, perhaps financial if anyone needs money. You know, we try to organize fundraisers and so forth. I'm seeing people not through the, not on the internet or not through the social media. I see everyone face to face every morning. You know, we meet in the center of Tashkent for breakfast, and right now there are over 100 people in the club. I attend other gatherings that other people organize. And what I'm seeing is most people are devastated. Countryless, they don't know what the future holds for them. They're trying to live day by day. Really hard to build big plans right now. We're trying to survive, plain and simple.
It's reminiscent, isn't it? Well, I know neither of us were alive then, but it's reminiscent of the emigre communities scattered across Europe in the 1920s. And what I found fascinating is that similar kind of routes, during the Russian Revolution, people escaped to the, Constantinople, as it then was. They escaped to the Ottoman Empire. And then via that route, and Armenia and other places, they then came to Paris and Berlin. Um, it's horrific, isn't it, that several generations on, so many people are repeating that pattern. We can only hope, obviously, in the revolution, most of those people didn't go back. We can only hope that once this is over, people will be able to return and potentially fashion a new country, especially if they've spent months or even a couple of years outside. They may well have, got used to self-organizing. They may have some visions about where the country could go.
Jonathan, there are two things I'd like to mention. First, it's funny you mentioned it, but I've been thinking lately about the very same thing. I think that we are repeating the steps of Russians who fled from Bolshevik Revolution 100 years ago. 100 years ago to the day, okay? And I feel like in 100 years, we as a society in Russia, we haven't learned much. Okay, we're making the very same mistakes and we're paying the very same price for the mistakes, because Russians leaving Russia is a tragedy. It's a humanitarian tragedy, economic tragedy, social tragedy, emotional tragedy for the country, for Russia. Let me tell you, I did not see one uneducated person around me. Higher education, IT, brain surgeons, doctors, attorneys, teachers, university professors, you name it. All people who are confident, who are skilled, who have professions, who have trades, who are full of energy, who are courageous. The best people. Russia could use people like that. They're the foundation of the prosperity of Russia. They left. And you know what? Second, you're making a mistake. And many people making the same very mistake. They say, especially in the West, they say, well, once it's over, this Russian's going to go back and try to rebuild the country. They're going to be the hope for Russia, the new Russia. No, read my lips. No, we will not go back. I have yet to see one person out of hundreds, perhaps thousands that I've met. And I ask this very question. If everything goes back to normal, you plan on going back? And you know what? Every single one says no. So, no.
And that I mean, I can understand why as well. Yeah, absolutely.
We've been betrayed. That's why we have been betrayed.
Exactly.
And we just don't want to. It's a terrible feeling when your country chews you up and spits you out,
I can appreciate that. And it's very simplistic, isn't it, to think that somehow...
Sorry for being a little emotional. But
no.
It's such a...
I mean, this channel is all about... This channel is all about challenging myths, because it's myths that have led to these problems. And it's not going to be so simple. But Russia is going to still exist in some form. Ukraine is going to exist. And somehow they're going to need to find a way to coexist in the future. And it seems to me that only people who've been on the outside, seen the lies for what they are, as you've said, will have any kind of chance of repairing the relations between Russians, not Russia the state, but Russians and Ukrainians. But maybe that's only something that can be done on an individual level, like you described at the head of the interview, by reaching out to people, by acknowledging what's happened and building one-on-one bridges.
Again, I say for the second time during this interview, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the things I'm trying to do is I have created this gathering. We call it the breakfast club. When people, it's really a support club, support circle. We just get together for breakfasts and we mingle, we meet new people, we try to support one another and so forth. But we're Russians, okay? And I am the person who came up with the idea and who has executed. And I have another idea in mind. There is a Ukrainian community in Tashkent. I'm seeing cars with Ukrainian license plates here and there. I know a couple colleagues, former colleagues, current colleagues of mine, Ukrainian, working for Western companies. Not as many as Russians in the city, but there are some. And my next project, well, not a project, but next urge, that's what I really want to do, is I want to meet some of the Ukrainians who have fled this bloodshed. I want to talk to them, to introduce myself, to explain what I stand for. And I want to make the first step. I want to get together some people from our breakfast club and Ukrainians together. I'm still thinking it over, perhaps just at a pub to have beers, something like that, very simple. Because you know what? I realized that someone needs to start taking, first steps on doing that. I don't know anything about others. making steps like that. Countries, that's too far away from me. This is me right here. I'm standing on the ground, and I know some Russians, and I know some Ukrainians. I will know more Ukrainians, and I just want to make things happen right here on my level. And then we'll see where it takes it from here. We'll see where it'll lead to in the future.
That's a great step, and I think it has to happen at some point. And if it's not initiated by governments, then individuals, as you say, have to take that responsibility. But I'm sure it's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be easy.
Well, somebody's got to do it. I understand it's not going to be. And you know what? I expect a few Ukrainians, if I introduce myself, to take rocks and start throwing at me. I know that it's possible, but I will still do it. I will still be trying.
It's not unlike, in some respects, talking to people from the Indian subcontinent, talking to people from Ireland, and realizing that as English people, we're quite ignorant, I think, of our imperial history. We have a rosy view of it. And then when you really start opening up well, my ancestors from Ireland, so I can sort of enter that conversation slightly more easily. But then you realize that they have a greater knowledge on their side of the crimes that were done in the past. They have that memory that goes back to their grandparents and great-grandparents, and they pass that knowledge on through generations in a way the English perhaps do not, at least when it comes to that imperial politics. So I think there's something to learn there as well from other countries' experience. And I'm not even saying the English learned that particularly well. Brexit shows there's this repeated nostalgia for an imperial past that can just, when you think it's dead and buried, you think it's gone, it resurges and affects the present. And I think there's some similarities there. I mean, everyone who's English watching this is going to absolutely hate what I just said there, but I think
But you know what I really admire about you English people? That you actually stand up, and you publicly admit and say that. That's really great.
And there's some interesting comparisons. So my grandparents were burnt out of their family business. My great-grandparents were burnt out of their family business in the 1910s. And there's an extraordinary connection there when you compare it to the Wagner Group and Prigozhin going to jails and liberating the kind of criminals, murderers, scum from there, because the British did something very similar. They emptied the prisons and they sent people to repress the local Irish population because the regular army wouldn't do it. The regular army kind of often would refuse to carry out those kind of terroristic orders. So there's this extraordinary kind of, I think, echo from history there. And that's something that terrifies me, is the idea that someone like Prigozhin, may well, his power potentially within the regime has increased as a result of this war. I mean, it's terrifying what might come next.
Makes two of us. I am also very terrified.
I guess there's nothing we can say or really do about that. We have to wait and see what's going to happen. It's quite an unstable and completely unpredictable situation now, isn't it?
Very much so.
Well, I mean, we can only hope that things turn around. We can only hope that the war ends. And, I think it's too optimistic to think that everything's going to come right there. It's too optimistic to think there'll be a liberal revolution. But right now, ending the war and starting that process of reconciliation is got to be the main priority. I mean, I really hope that you find some stability in your life in Tashkent. I've been there. I mean, it's a beautiful city. I've been to Samarkand. It's an extraordinary country. I hope that you're being welcomed. You and your compatriots are being sort of welcomed, and that there isn't any ill feeling to the Russians who've sought refuge there. But I can only hope that things work out.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.